I think one has to reassess the role of the regulatory authorities and what happened. The banks, of course, are in trouble, and indeed, Spain has been asking or has asked for a bailout out of its banks. And unfortunately, it turns out the banks got in trouble because of real estate problems in Spain. That happened in Ireland too. So there's an interrelationship, unfortunately, between the banks and the countries themselves. And what I mean by that is that in some cases, banks will load up with the sovereign debt of the country in which they're headquartered. If the country encounters financial difficulties, the debt issued by that country becomes worth less. If banks are holding relatively large amounts of that debt, then the banks get into trouble. And then sometimes the countries get into trouble and they want to sell more debt as they have to continue financing the activities of the central government. And then the banks buy that debt, and it just drags down the banks as the countries are trying to grapple with their problems. So what we have here is, unfortunately, when countries get into trouble, sometimes their banks get into trouble because the banks are holding the debt of the country in which they're headquartered. So that's the case in some of the Eurozone countries. And then what people do is they try to get away from the banks, try to move their funds out of the banks or sell the stock of the banks, not buy the debt of the banks, as well as to be more reluctant to buy the debt issued by the sovereign countries. So interest rates go up, and that just actually exacerbates the problems in those countries. Now the question is, where were the regulatory authorities? They should have been monitoring banks and be heavily concerned when countries were getting into trouble, and should have been very concerned when banks were loading up on the sovereign debt of the countries that were indeed seeing their fortunes fade away, and as countries continually found themselves in ever worse financial and economic conditions.